Shannon. Welcome to Disabled and Proud. How are you today?
I'm very good. Thank you for having me on. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. And thank you so much for giving up the time to be on the podcast today. I am really looking forward to this because I think you might have been one of the first limb difference creators that I ever followed on Instagram. So I'm really looking forward to this chat.
Oh, really? Oh my gosh, wow.
So, first question that I ask every single guest, and I actually really need to change the way that I say this because I think I've repeated this on at least 20 episodes, but it is, how do you refer to your disability?
So I refer to mine as a limb difference.
Mm-hmm.
So my limb difference is ectrodactyly, which is the super long scientific term for it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I refer to myself as either disabled or a person with a limb difference.
Yeah. And for you, you were born disabled like me. Am I right? Yeah.
Yeah, so I was born with a congenital limb difference.
Mm-hmm.
It is a genetic limb difference. So
Okay.
unlike sort of amniotic band syndrome and things like that happen in the womb, mine is in my genetics, so it would have happened regardless. So yeah, it is genetic. I am the only person in my family, though, with ectrodactyly, which is interesting, seeing as though it is genetic.
Yeah. Wow. Like, this is what I love about having these conversations is that this is stuff that I would never in a million years know. Like there's nowhere to turn to find this information unless we have these kind of conversations. And isn't that amazing that on paper we both are limb different, and yet our disability and how we relate to it and how it will like impact and impede our lives is completely different.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I love that. Like,
Oh, I know. I was shocked to find out how many different types of limb differences there was, or there are. Um, I grew up thinking I was literally the only person in the world with
yeah.
with two fingers, like until I discovered Instagram, and then I realized how many people have a limb difference, and then on top of that, how many different limb differences there are.
Yeah.
Um, including like genital, non-congenital. Like it's just there's so much variety. But I think the beautiful thing is we all relate to each other, even though
Yeah.
it's so different. There's so much in common as well.
Yeah, like exactly that point. I think that's such an important point for limb difference, but also like disability in general, because I know I say it a lot, but on paper you could have the exact same diagnosis, but how you like interact with your disability and how the world interacts with you is going to be completely individual for every single person. There's literally no such thing as one size fits all when it comes to disability. And I think a lot of people forget that.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. Disability looks different on every single person. There is no one way to be disabled, and I think that is a common misconception.
Yeah.
Is disability looks a certain way, which is completely not true. And within that, I think a lot of people in the limb difference community do not identify as disabled as well.
Yeah.
So that's another sort of sub level to it. Is even if you've got a limb difference, you might not necessarily identify as disabled, whereas some do. I personally do. But yeah, there's so many layers to it, so many levels to it. And like you say, everyone has that different experience, which is why everyone chooses to also identify in a different way.
Yeah, 100%. So it's really interesting that you said that when you were younger, you thought you were like the only person in the world with two fingers. And I was wondering if you could, talk to us a bit about what your childhood was like, because I know what mine was like as a limb difference kid, and I had a great time, but that's not always everybody's experience. So I was wondering what yours was like.
Yeah. So yeah, my initial sort of experience as a baby, not that I can remember, but from what I know, was quite a lot because
Mm.
I had to go through multiple surgeries. So I was actually born with one finger on each hand and two toes on each foot. And
Okay.
I went through multiple surgeries to basically transplant a toe from each of my feet onto my hands to make me a thumb, to basically give me 2 fingers on each hand. So that was obviously a lot to go through.
Yeah, that's a lot.
A baby. So I don't remember any of that, thankfully. So my actual childhood that I remember was absolutely fine. I don't particularly have any standout memories, negative memories of being different until high school. That's when sort of it became an issue for me, not physically but mentally. That's when I really started to struggle. So up until probably the age of maybe 12, I didn't really think about the fact that I was different, or not that I can remember. But yeah, from that moment of joining high school, becoming a teenager, integrating with children who you haven't grown up with, who are coming from different schools, everyone's getting to that age where you want to impress people, you want to fit in, you want to look like everybody else. That was when it sort of became like a problem for me mentally. So I'd say I probably suffered mentally more in my teenage years rather than physically, which people would expect it to be a physical barrier, whereas I found it mental. Probably up until about 4 years ago when I actually started my Instagram and changed my attitude and the way that I perceive myself. Up until that point of maybe being 21-ish. So yeah, all the way throughout teenage years to that age, I struggled quite a lot.
Yeah, and I think firstly, thank you for saying for saying that, because it's not easy to talk about when you like look back when you've had a difficult time. It's not easy to look back and be like, actually, I was a bit unhappy, or like, you know, actually like shit was hard for me. Like it wasn't always the easiest. So like, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think it's super important that we have these conversations, because like I had the complete opposite experience, and yet we still have the same disability. So like it's so interesting to see the different experiences that we all have. But I think what you said about changing how you saw yourself is really key and really integral, because I think you've almost got to, like, at the end of the day, like, you're your own best friend, because you're the longest relationship that you have with yourself in your entire life. And so for you, what was it that like sparked this journey of changing your perception of yourself?
Honestly, I think it was because I'd so like intensely hated who I was for so many years. Like I can't describe how horrible that feeling was of constantly hiding, like wearing long sleeves, not putting my hand up in class, being constantly paranoid that I was being stared at, not just like at school, but in any situation. If I went shopping and out on the street, just constantly feeling like an animal in a cage that was at a zoo being stared at. Honestly, it was such a horrible feeling. And I was just sick of feeling restrained by that and like confined. And I didn't want to like be restricted on. I mean, I wouldn't put myself forward for certain opportunities because I'd be thinking about, well, are people going to see my hands? Are people going to see my feet? So I got to that age where I just thought life is so short, and something needs to change. I'm not sure how it's going to change, but I know something needs to be done so I don't feel that way anymore, because it's just so like exhausting mentally to be constantly in that mind frame. So I actually started to read a book called The Secret. I don't know if you've come across it. All about sort of manifesting law of attraction, the way that our thoughts change our lives and how we feel. And honestly, that book changed my life. I will say that. It really made me take a step back and think, oh my gosh, the way that I'm thinking is having this impact on my life. Like I'm willing all of this into existence because of how negative I think about myself. Something needs to change and I need to stop doing that. And don't get me wrong, it wasn't a case of waking up the next day and be like, I love who I am, you know, this is
Yeah.
me walking out with my hands in the air, like, you know, check me out. It definitely wasn't that
Yeah.
at all. But one day I just made the conscious decision to start an Instagram blog, and it was never meant to be public. No one was ever really
Yeah.
meant to read it. It was meant to just be a space for me to document progress and document my
Yeah.
feelings. And if I managed to go out of the house one day without long sleeves on, I'd post a picture of that and be like, maybe a way of holding myself accountable because it was
Yeah.
being documented somewhere. And it was good for me to be able to look back and be like, you know, this is what I've achieved personally.
Mhm.
And then through like using hashtags, limb difference and things like that, I met other people online with limb
Yeah.
differences, and I was like, oh, it's not just me. Like,
I'm
wait
not
a
the
minute.
only one.
Wait a minute. Wow, this is incredible. And I remember coming across one particular girl who had a hand just like me, and she'd got engaged and she was wearing a ring, which is something I never thought I would be able to do because I
Yeah.
didn't want to draw attention to my hands. I never wanted to be in that position where I had to wear a ring. So I was super like embarrassed about that. And I
Yeah.
was like, do you know what? If I can see this girl living her life and doing that, and she's the exact same as me, then there's no reason why I can't do that.
Yeah.
Um, and that's what sort of then snowballed it into me being more motivated and feeling more encouraged to take this one step further and really push myself with what I felt like I could do. Um, and then as I kept posting more, people kept following me. And then I was getting messages from people saying I'd had that effect on them, where they'd seen
Yeah.
my posts and they then felt confident to do something because they'd seen me do it. And I was like, oh my gosh, like it's like a full circle moment.
Yeah.
And that feeling is like nothing I could describe. That amazing feeling knowing that I'd taken the step to do something and it's made my life a little bit better, but I've also been able to share that and be completely raw and honest with how I'm feeling. And that's helped somebody else. And I was just like, wow, this is amazing.
Yeah.
Something something I never thought I'd be able to do. Um, so yeah, it literally went from there. And then because I was getting these amazing messages, it just made me like carry on.
Yeah.
And here we are, like 4 years later now, 2019, I think that started. So yeah, it's been
Wow.
a ride.
It's so interesting because I very, very clearly remember seeing the first post of yours that I was like, oh, like you're like, we're kind of similar. I mean, like very different, but also kind of
Yeah.
similar. Like, and it was because it was something that really upset me. So I know it upset you. And I remember your post about it. And it was when the witches made Anne Hathaway have her hands completely different. And it was the whole conversation between why is it acceptable to put a villain
Hmm.
or like, you know, make a villain disabled, because that is only ever going to perpetuate all of the issues that the disabled community have. You're
Yeah.
literally just making it 10 times harder. And I remember it so well because I remember thinking like, oh my goodness, this gal, like, because I think you wrote on your hands, didn't you, something like you're beautiful or like I'm not a witch. And
Yeah.
I remember reading that and thinking the world needs to see that, because at this point in time Hollywood has just given arguably one of their biggest female stars the worst role ever.
Yeah. 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 Honestly, during that time, I'd not really started posting videos at all at that time.
Yeah.
And I remember this all came out and I'd seen an article about it. And the feeling that I got in my stomach, I was just so full of like, I needed to do something. Like I needed to
Yeah.
say something. And at this point, I maybe had like 400 followers. So I wasn't intending to go and speak to a massive audience of people, but I just knew I had to say something
Yeah.
and just a way to document how I was feeling and just get it out. And I just came home from work, put my hair up in a bobble, had a jumper on, no makeup, anything, and just spoke to my camera and just like posted it.
Yeah.
And then that video just like went, and so many people were just watching it, and I was like, oh my gosh, I did not expect this at all. And then over the next few days, that's when I just decided, I was thinking about my hands, and I was like, my hands look exactly like this witch that is being shown in this horrible film about how, you know, she's such an evil character, and this is a characteristic she's being given to enhance that scary vibe. And I was like, my hands aren't scary. If you'd have asked me 5 years ago, I'd have said yes they are, but I'm not in that mindset anymore. And I don't want a 3-year-old with the same disability as me to see that and then that reaffirm the message in their head that it is something that's scary. So I was looking at my hands, I was like, you know what, I'm just going to write beautiful on my hand and just take a picture and post it. And I never ever thought that it would be a picture that made a difference or anything, but that picture went everywhere. And whenever I speak to people on podcasts, that is a picture that always gets brought up, and I still to this day don't realize how many people actually saw that picture. But yeah, that was like the key, I think, into where my Instagram journey sort of went to where it is now. That was like the very start of it.
And I love that, because like I love it when people kind of like fall into what they're doing and they're like, I just wanted to speak some truth, and like now it's snowballed and here we are. Like I think that's always like the best way. When you start something, it's always the best way to do it, rather than being like, I'm going to do this because I want this out of it, and I'm going to get this much money, and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, like you really got like, it's got really good intentions behind that. But everything that you just said is like actually, and what I loved is that you spoke about, you never want to see like a younger person with the same disability as you and feel like, you know, that they're different and like that they're not beautiful, because that's something that I think about quite a lot as well. Is it, I always think, what if there's a younger version of me who's not as confident, or a younger person with a different disability, and they can hear like these conversations and even listen to them and be like, oh, like they're doing okay, so that means that I can do okay. And like for me, I think that's the biggest thing in the world, and it sounds pretty similar to you. I think that there's nothing better than being able to help younger people on that journey of actually being like yeah, you are disabled, but actually it's freaking awesome.
100%. And it's because I know there is people out there at that stage I was at as a 16-year-old, and I hate that. I hate knowing that there's people who haven't got out of that mindset yet, and they're probably trying really hard to get to a better place but can't see how they're going to get there. And that just honestly really breaks my heart, because I know that was me, and I didn't have anything to go out and watch and to consume on Instagram, and I fell into it by accident. So, you know, it's sad to think that there is people out there, and I don't want there to be people out there. That's the point. I want to make disability as visible as possible, and I want us all to be represented, so then the generation that's growing up now can see themselves represented on TV, adverts, social media. Like, it's not a taboo thing, and it's just a normal thing that you see. People are different, that's fine, move on. Like, it's not something that needs to be shamed or you need to feel embarrassed about. And when that film came out, I was like, oh no, like I need to say something about this, because if I can just help one person realize that this is wrong, then that's fine. But it went a lot further than that, which is something I could never have expected.
And it's interesting that you say, you know, around 16, that age, that was like a really unhappy period for you, because that is a formative age, particularly surrounding like career and what you're going to do next in your life. Is it A levels? Is it college? Is it uni? Or are you going to go into work? And I was wondering for you, how was that time affected because of your disability, or like it might not have even been something that you thought about?
That time was, so it never impacted me academically. Like, I was always actually very bright at school, and I got really good GCSEs and A levels, but it was more the personal life. And I was terrified that I would never have anybody because of my disability. You know, you see friends that are getting boyfriends and they're, you know, chatting to people, they're texting people. I never had that. And I think it's because I didn't put myself out there. I don't think it was because no one particularly fancied me. but I convinced myself nobody would. Therefore, I didn't put myself out there to go date a guy or whatever, because I was like, well, I'm going to get rejected anyway, so there's no point. Like, sort of saving myself that awful
Almost
feeling.
like cutting your own nose off to spite your face, because
Yeah,
like, if I don't put myself out there, I don't get hurt, and therefore it doesn't reaffirm the idea that I have about
yeah,
myself.
yeah, 100%. And I genuinely believed at that time in my life that it meant that I was less than my friends. Like,
Mm.
say if me and my friends were lined up and there was a group of guys, I would never get picked. That's how I imagined it in my head. And
Yeah.
thoughts like that as a 16-year-old, I mean, as a 16-year-old, there's not, a lot of things that you think are important in life. And
Yeah.
one of the main things you're thinking about is boys or girls or whatever.
Yeah.
And that was one thing that really did sort of affect me, was thinking, no one's ever going to look at me like that. I had loads of amazing friends. Like, I had a really big friendship group. And I thought to myself, I'm always just going to be seen as like, oh, Shannon's like the funny girl who everyone loves to be friends with, but she's never someone who you want to date because, oh, she's different and, she's got a disability. And
Yeah.
I always saw myself as like damaged, and that's awful, because I would never look at anybody else like that.
Yeah.
But the internal ableism in me, that's how I genuinely saw myself. And now I look back, I'm like, that is honestly horrible that I ever thought that about myself. And it
Yeah.
doesn't make sense either, because I would never think that about another person. So it's weird how your mind works and makes you believe it about yourself.
Yeah. The mind is like a complex being, but neuroscience is fascinating. Like, if you like ever dip your toe into neuroscience, like, it completely changes your life. Like, I don't care who you are or like what your disability is, like, put your toe into neuroscience and your whole brain is about to get exploded.
I would say I've never looked into it, but maybe.
Oh, honestly, like, it's all about how like your brain is wired, and like the thoughts that you have and the thoughts that you repeat, and the reasons as to like why the thoughts that you repeat are negative get stronger, and the ones that you don't repeat that tend to be positive, like, don't build as such a strong pathway. And it's like super fascinating. So like, it's all to do with like the synapses in your brain. So like, every time you have a thought, it creates like the best way to describe it is almost like a train track. So then if you have that thought more and more and more, the train track gets more used and more used and more used, and it almost becomes like an automatic thing. Whereas if you know that you're having those thoughts, you have to almost interrupt them, because if you interrupt them, you think about them less, the bonds get weaker. And if you can think about something else, so like more positive thoughts, they get stronger. And then as you kind of like grows, not the right word, but like as you develop, your brain develops, your brain does this thing where it cuts out what's no longer needed. So like those negative thoughts or those positive thoughts, whichever ones that you're reaffirming, your brain essentially scoops them out. So like then it's useless matter to it. So it kind of just like scoops them away. It's very, very, very like really basic like description of it, but like that's the basis of it. And it's so fascinating what the mind and what the brain can do and how they work in conjunction with each other. Like, so good. Blows my mind every time I read about it. I'm like, I'm kind of glad I had this information, but equally also not.
Yeah. I'm gonna look into that actually, because I feel like I would be super interested by
100%. So for you, what was it like when you were choosing careers? Because some people, their disability it doesn't even touch a side of what they want to do. But for some other people, it's something that they do consider, and how they will work in the workspace and all of that type of thing. And I was wondering, was it ever consideration for you that you thought, oh, like, if I do this, will I be able to do this? Or if I want to do that, can I do that? Was that ever something that you went through?
Yeah, definitely. It's almost like I sort of ruled things out straight away. So I told myself I could never be a teacher, because I would never want to get in front of a class of students and write on a whiteboard with my hands.
Yeah.
Something as simple as that. I was like, yeah, so I can't be a teacher. Like, completely ruled that out of my head.
Yeah.
Even though, thinking maybe back, maybe that's something that I might have wanted to try, but I just automatically like ruled it out. Like, no, I'm never going to feel comfortable enough to stand in front of children. Children also ask lots of questions, which is great because they're, they want to know why someone looks different, and they should absolutely be educated on that. But as like a 16-year-old, I didn't think that was a good thing. And I was like, no, I can't do that. So yeah, there was definitely certain things that I'd ruled out because I'd convinced myself that I wouldn't be able to do it, even though I absolutely would. It was more of a mental sort of thing than a physical. I knew I could physically be a teacher, but mentally I didn't know if I could cope with those daunting situations. So I went to university I wanted to be a psychologist, basically. But because of my limb difference and my insecurities, I actually didn't make it past like the second week of university because mentally I was in such a bad place, like meeting new people. As you can imagine, I don't know if you went to university, but when you go to university, you you don't know anybody, and you've got to put yourself out there, because if you don't,
you're gonna have no
then
friends.
exactly. And as someone with a disability with major self-esteem issues, that was like an impossible task for me, to put myself out there and speak to people and make new connections and friendships, because I was convinced 100% that as soon as those people discovered about my hands and my feet, they'd be like, oh no, I don't want to be friends with Shannon. So therefore,
hearing this is like, it's breaking my heart that you felt that way. But I'm like, again, like I said, like, thank you for sharing this, because I know it's not easy, and I know I just interrupted you in the middle of a flow, so I do apologize.
Yeah, it was I think that when I think back to that time, that is the lowest I've ever been in my whole entire life at 18. Because ultimately I let my insecurities ruin my whole university experience, and I was having panic attacks to the point where I was crying, but there was no tears coming out. It was just, my body was making like a physical movement of like sobbing with no tears. It was just like my whole body was affected physically by the anxiety and stress that this situation was putting on me, that I'd created in my own head. No one had said anything to me about my limb difference. No one had given me any evidence to say that they didn't want to be my friend because of my limb difference. But I'd like cultivated all of that in my head, that was my reality. So I just shut myself away in my like dorm room. I wouldn't even go into the kitchen and like interact with the 6 other people that was sharing my flat. Like, honestly, it was such an isolating time, to the point where like I just had to leave. I remember driving home one day. So I went to university in Sheffield, and I live near Leeds, so it was like a 40-minute drive. I just literally got in my car, drove for 40 minutes, like completely sobbing, and I just pulled up at home, and my mum was already stood at the door waiting for me, because my boyfriend had texted her to say, I think Shannon's on her way home. Because I'd like sort of rang him crying at university, like I just can't do it. So she was waiting for me, and so I tried to travel for like a couple of days because I didn't have to live there. But ultimately that got the better of me, and I went to the doctors, and I was like, all these physical feelings, the chest pains and everything that you're feeling, you're not poorly, you've got like severe anxiety. And I was like, wow, I'd never experienced anything to that extent before until that moment. So in terms of my career, I was like, oh my gosh, what now? I've quit university because of the mental impact that my disability is having on me. What am I going to do? I was literally unemployed for 6 months whilst I was trying to find, because for me, I thought I could never work at Asda on the checkouts because I can't handle money. It's too fiddly. So, if someone needs change and I've got to try and get the 5 pences and the 1 pences, like, I'm never going to cope in that situation. I could do it, but it would be very faffy, and I'd get embarrassed, and I'd be like, no, I can't do that. Because of my limb difference on my feet, I really struggle with like mobility and standing up for long periods. So I was like, I can't work in a warehouse because I'm not going to be able to stand up for that long. I need to be sat down. I was like, what am I going to do?
Like,
so
where am I going to go?
100%. So I mean, the whole uni experience and then the 6 months following uni was like super dark time. When I think back to those times, every time I go to Sheffield, I get that, it's like sort of like PTSD, like that feeling. because that's what I associate Sheffield with now, is that awful time in my life. So eventually I found an apprenticeship in law, and for the past 7 years I've worked in law. So it did all work out, and I always say everything happens for a reason. Like, that is my motto. Everything happens for a reason. Like, I had
It's mine too.
I've always said that. And sometimes it's hard to know what that reason is whilst you're in like the deep pits of it, and it's really, really hard time. But I came out of that on the other side, and I got a apprenticeship in law. I worked my way up to like a senior legal assistant, and I only recently just left that in December, and I now work with a prosthetic company. So it's like it all worked out the way it was meant to be. I'm happiest that I've ever been right now.
Yeah.
I'm doing what I know I was put on this earth to do right now.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a really tough time, but I've got to where I am, and yeah, everything is always on time, and everything is always the way that it's meant to be. I truly believe.
Thank you for sharing that, because as I said earlier, like, I know it's not easy to talk about dark times, but I like to think that if in those dark times that you can look back and even pick out one positive attribute about yourself, you've learned something about yourself. And I was wondering, during your tough times, is there something that you look back on and you're pretty proud of the way that you handled something, or a particular positive attribute that stands out in your mind?
Yeah, I think I want to say not giving up. I know I gave up with the university in terms of I quit university, but I didn't give up in terms of life.
Yeah.
Things can get really, really hard, and people can get to a really, really horrible place. And I'd never, even when I quit university, I was like, right, but I need to find a job. I can't just not do anything. Like, I need to keep going. I need to find something. And I think it's just like that determination of, right, okay, it's not worked out, but it will work out. Something will come along. And just like having that trust in the process of knowing that this is a really tough time, but it's not going to be like this forever, and not giving up at that point when you're in the dark space, because it's super easy to do that. So I think maybe just strength, like, it requires a lot of strength to get out of that. So yeah, I think I can take that from that situation.
Yeah. And what I love what you said is that, yes, you did quit uni, but you didn't quit, because I think there's a big, big difference in quitting something that you know is not serving you, right? For example, like uni, you knew it wasn't serving you for whatever reason. It just wasn't meant to be, and it wasn't going to work out. So you quit it. But actually, that was the best decision that you made for yourself at that point in time. But you didn't quit on, like, wanting to find a job and like wanting to carry on. And I think that there's always such a big difference in like knowing when to stop and it's right for you, but making sure that you still move forward with that momentum.
Yeah, 100%. And I just want everyone to know that, like, don't give up.
Yeah.
Because it gets brighter and it gets sunnier. Trust me.
It's really interesting you say that, because actually I was about to ask you what piece of advice you would give to two pieces of advice. One for a younger version of yourself. So imagine like young Shannon sat next to you.
Okay.
But also, it could be the same piece of advice, could be different, totally up to you. A piece of advice for someone who's younger with the same disability as you.
Okay. Yes, I think I've got a piece of advice that covers both of those.
Yeah.
And it's something that I'm super passionate about. And I would like to say, if I could literally sit down and have a conversation with like 13-year-old Shannon, stop watering yourself down to fit this mold that you don't fit in.
Yeah.
You're trying to squish yourself into a mold that isn't fit for you.
Yeah.
You're already in your own mold. Stop trying to jump out of that into something else, because you are who you are. You don't need to change. You don't need to water yourself down or not be who you are and hide yourself. For what? For what reason? Because you're trying to impress other people, or you're trying to make an impression on other people. really, it doesn't matter what other people think. It's about you and your life, and ultimately those other people might, they don't care what you think, so why do you care what they think? Like, yeah, I spent a lot of years caring too much and trying to be different. I remember praying for 5 fingers and 5 toes, which is super sad, because I don't know what I thought would happen. I don't know if I'd thought I'd wake up one day and just be like magic, like. But yeah, I remember thinking like, I really wish one day I would wake up and I'd have normal feet. And I hate that word now. There's no such thing as normal. Every single one of us is different in every single way. Like, there's no such thing as normal. And I think I would just tell younger me, stop trying to be normal.
Yeah.
There is no such thing as normal. Celebrate who you are. And it's the differences that you've got that are so valuable. Like, I have got so much valuable, like, knowledge and, like, understanding for other people because of how I am.
Yeah.
And that makes me who I am. And it's ultimately led me to where I am today, working in a prosthetic company for people with limb differences, which is honestly just amazing. Like, I just would want every single younger person to feel like they don't have to try and change themselves, because there's nothing wrong with how they are.
Yeah. Oh God, when you said that about how you prayed for like having five fingers and 5 toes, like, it made my heart like actually like break a little bit, because I can so imagine and I can so see as to why that was like an acceptable thing for you to do at that point in your life. Because where is the representation? Where are you seeing yourself? Where can you go somewhere and see someone who looks like you, or or even like disability in general? Like, it didn't exist. And so like, no wonder you felt the way you felt, because you felt like, and you said it, like, you felt like you were the only one in the world. And that, I just want to give like younger version of you like the biggest hug and be like, right, gal, like, we got this.
Honestly, me too. Like, I think that all the time. Like, if I could let younger me peel back a window and just see into 2023, and have a look at my Instagram feed and just see what I've done and see every connection that I've made, like, she would be like, no way, she would just not believe it. And that would just give past me the boost that she needed to get through those really awful, terrible times. And I think like the world is getting better with representation and inclusion, and you see it now in magazines, like amazing advertisements that have got a range of body types and different disabilities. I'm like, yes, that's what we need to see. But when I don't remember seeing anything like that as a child, which, like you say, made me feel very alienated, because I was like, well, I'm not seeing anyone else like me. I am the only person, therefore people are going to look at me and think, oh, that's weird, because I don't see it anywhere. And that's what makes people stare, is because, as well, if you are like an able-bodied person, you don't have a disability and you don't have difference, you don't know anyone with a difference, if you see someone in the street who looks different, you are probably going to stare, because it's human nature to be like, oh, that's different, and take a second glance, because they're not seeing it on TV and they're not seeing it represented. But if they start to see it, they're going to be like, it's not going to be a bigger deal to other people as well when they see you in the street, because like, oh yeah, I saw someone on TV that looks like that, like it's fine.
Exactly that. And what you said about when you were younger and there was no representation, it was like the exact same for me. So I'm not that much older than you. And I always think about when I was little, like, I never ever saw myself in like a magazine. I never ever saw myself on TV. Never ever saw myself as like a romantic love interest on TV, film, radio, like that. It didn't exist. And like, to a certain extent it still doesn't, but you are right, we are getting better. But like, no wonder younger versions of like you and me, not so much, but I think that's probably because I'm a bit of a gobby arsehole sometimes. But like, no wonder there's a real, there is a problem for younger disabled people when they can't see themselves, because where do they turn to? And like, thank God. I know that Instagram is sometimes the worst thing in the world, but equally, like, thank God for it, so that people can kind of reach out and actually realize that, like, as you said, like, they're completely perfect the way that they are.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And I think they are the two things that changed my life, is the law of attraction and Instagram.
Yeah.
And if I said to someone like Instagram changed my life, they'd be like, what? Like, that sounds ridiculous, but genuinely,
Yeah.
if I had not have met the community of people and made the connections, like one of my closest friends who is coming to my wedding, I met on Instagram through the hashtag Limb Difference. Like, she's now one of my besties. Like, we work together now. It's just like an incredible, mind-blowing like thing that has come from me posting a few pictures on Instagram. Like, honestly, it changed my life. And it's just amazing that there's that community of people, because I think ultimately that's how we change our mindset, is like pulling off other people and getting that support and getting that positivity and seeing ourselves in other people. So yeah, it's amazing.
Oh, I love that. So I like to ask everybody about the weird questions that they get, because as a disabled person, you're gonna get some bizarre questions, right?
Yeah.
And actually, like, I think if we don't laugh about them, if we actually thought about them a bit too much, we'd probably all cry, because some of them are absolutely ridiculous. And I was just wondering, like, have you got any particular weird questions that stick out in your mind?
So someone once asked me how I eat, and I was like, so basically what I do is I put the food in my mouth and then I chew it, and then
Oh my God.
I was like, sorry, what do you mean? Like, they just couldn't comprehend how I could possibly like pick up a piece of food and eat it. And I'm like, well, I can still hold like a fork. It's just like people, it's like they have no imagination, or they cannot think outside the box. Like, that's where most of these stupid questions come from. I've had someone ask me if the reason, so I've been very open. I mean, I'm 26, and I've said, right now I don't want children. Like, it's not in my immediate future. Don't know if it's in my future at all, but right now, like, just doesn't interest me.
Yeah, like if it happened next week, it would like be one of the worst things that could happen.
Yeah, like, I really don't want that. And someone said to me, "Oh, is that because you don't want to pass on your disability?" No, that's just because I don't want a child to look after right now, with, shitty nappies and everything else that comes with it, and no sleep. That's the reason. I
love my bed.
Yeah, I was like, never once has my limb difference or disability been brought into this conversation, so please don't make that assumption that that's the reason why I don't want a child. Again, that goes back to outdated, horrible conceptions about disability and how you wouldn't want a disabled child. But yeah, some of these questions, I just think, do these people think before they say these things? Or
I honestly love hearing about these, because I think the more that you like highlight how bizarre some of the questions that you get, and like, part of me really hopes that out there's someone who listens to this and they're like, oh, like, I definitely shouldn't have asked that question. Or they think a bit more before they do ask, like, what I would deem a ludicrous question. Because they're just like, sometimes it's like people have absolutely no filter, no boundary, no nothing. And you're like, where were you raised?
Yeah. I was like, I don't know if it's just because this is my life, so I know, like, that's a strange thing to ask, but yeah, some of the questions I just think, was you not taught that this is rude? It's bizarre.
I'm 100% with you, because I say this quite a lot. I forget that the normal, or like what is quote unquote normal anyway, but like, I forget that disability and being disabled isn't everybody's experience. Like that's something that I don't think about at all. Like, when I go to Sainsbury's, like, I'm like, oh yeah, people just getting their shopping, whatever. And I completely forget that people watching me like balance all my food on like one arm is like, is not the normal. Whereas, like, of course it is for me, because it's my lived reality. but for other people it's not. And so I kind of understand like why people have questions, but at the same time I'm like, either keep your questions to yourself or at least engage with me, and like we can maybe have like a back and like, you know, to and fro, and we can maybe like, you know, have a little chat. If you're going to congratulate me for carrying my sushi and be like, well done you, by the way, how do you do this? I'd be like, come on, Sharon, like we aren't friends, like I can't tell you this, and like also I don't need to tell you this either, like I don't owe you information.
Yeah I think that's it. I think questions are important because that's how people learn, and that's how you can change people's perspective. But there also is like a line that can be crossed, and if it's a rude question, you know, you, like you say, you do not owe anyone anything in terms of like medical history or anything that you don't want to share. That's fine. Like, you get a lot of people who are like open to any question, but you also get people, I think it's important to know and to realize that we're in a great space now mentally, like with who we are, and I'll say, you know, we are proud and we are disabled. However, there's a lot of people who are disabled who have either not accepted that yet, who are in a super dark place, who do not want those questions. That would have been my absolute worst nightmare at 16 years old. Like, I would have physically cried on the spot. I used to cry if I used to think someone was like looking at me in a shopping centre. That was just from being stared at. So, you know, if someone had approached me and said, oh, like, do you mind just telling me how you tie your shoelaces? Like, that's really interesting. No. So I think, yeah, absolutely, like, questions are amazing because that's how people learn. But, like, everyone is also very different. So those situations need to be approached with, like, a super sensitive, cautious mindset.
I absolutely agree. I think questions are important. And I think that there's, like you said, like questions are for learning, but it has to be in the right context, and it has to be contextually in the right setting.
Yeah.
Like the supermarket,
No.
personally, is not the right setting. Boots is not the right setting.
Yeah.
Over dinner, questionable, depends how well I know you. All
Yeah.
of these things have to be taken into consideration. And I think it's so important as well what you just said about other people who might not be as accepting of disability as we are, because there's a lot of people who acquire their disability. And even having questions about how that happened can actually be really triggering and really traumatic. And whilst questions are amazing, and what you said is so right, do approach with caution, because you don't know what mental trigger you might pull by asking these questions, particularly around acquired disabilities that are from an accident, or, you know, like you never know how someone became disabled if it's they acquired it. Whereas like I'm pretty open. I'm like, I was born very disabled. Like there's no way that I'm not going to be disabled. Like,
100%.
Same for everyone.
No. And like, I never actually used to accept the word disability. Like, if someone had said to me like, oh, are you disabled, I'd be like, no, don't say that, I'm not disabled, like, please don't use that word. Because until that's because I never had any education on disability. I didn't understand what it was to be disabled. I only knew the negative things attached to being disabled. So I thought it meant you wasn't independent, and I just saw it as a negative thing. So I was like, no, I'm not disabled. And then I got my Instagram. I started to follow lots of different people. I don't just follow people with limb differences. I like to follow literally anyone with a disability. I'm like, I want to learn. I want to know. The more I know, the better. And then I started to read a lot about disability. I was like, oh, like, this isn't this horrible thing that I've been brought to believe. Like, and I educated myself. No one educated me. I went out and I read that material and I saw lots of different posts about it. And then that changed my attitude on disability. And I was like, it's not a bad thing. And I am a disabled person. Like, I am. And I'm not going to deny it anymore because it's not something that I should be ashamed of. But I also do appreciate that there is other people out there that aren't at that point yet and don't like to be referred to as disabled. But I am a proud disabled woman.
I honestly love that, because disability is a journey, regardless of whether it's acquired or congenital. Like, it is, there's no two ways about it. And nobody, and I also like to point this out, nobody gives you like a stamp if you become disabled or you decide to identify as disabled. You don't suddenly get like a welcome pack through the post being like, this is the history and like this is everything about everyone, like enjoy. That doesn't exist. So you do have to go out there, because disability history is not taught in schools, disability education is not taught in schools. So everything that, like you said, everything and also equally everything I know, is either through lived experience or because I've learned it from someone else. Because that's the only way that you learn about disability, because we don't have like a structured curriculum for it. Like, it doesn't exist.
No.
So how lucky are we that we're like in a time where we can learn about it quite freely? Because I always think, at what point is it going to become a bit regimented? Because at some point it will do. But how, like, we're quite lucky, like we're getting to learn off loads of different people that, like, even 10-15 years ago we would never ever have had any interaction or connections with. And I think that that is the most powerful thing.
100%. And I think I didn't even know what the word ableism meant, never even heard of it until about maybe 2.5 years ago. If you'd have said that to me, I was like, what's that? And now I'm like, I know so much from just starting on Instagram and following people. And I'm like, wow, it's shocking how much stuff is out there that probably I still don't know, because I've not come across it yet. I wouldn't have known what ableism was unless I probably I just stumbled across it one day, but accidentally on my Instagram feed. And I was like, oh, did some research into it. I was like, oh, this is what ableism is. Looked at some examples of it and I was like, okay, so I've faced ableism pretty much all my life. I didn't even know it had a name.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly that. And it is like, I remember as well, the first one I was like, what is ableism? I can't really remember like how it came about. And I remember reading and I was like, oh my God, someone's been stalking me.
Yeah.
That's literally how I felt, because I was like, these experiences happen to me like daily basis.
Yeah.
And then once you're able to be like, oh, okay, that's ableism, and like you're favoring the able or the non-disabled because they are not disabled, doesn't mean that they're any better. Like, doesn't mean just because you can lift heavier than I can doesn't make you a better person.
Yeah.
And when you put it like that, it's wild, isn't it? Like, it's genuinely so wild that we, like, society favors the non-disabled. That blows my mind, because I always think about all the disabled people that I know, and every single one of them has some of the most incredible, powerful traits out of humans that people who aren't disabled wish that they had. And they're never gonna get. Like, I'm sorry, you're not. Like, you're not as cool as us.
I know. Honestly, it was my friend Nicole who was telling me about a study was done, and it was found that people with limb differences are actually better at problem solving than those without. Yeah, 100%. And it's like, because we've had to adapt to literally everything in our life. Yeah. Everything that we've come across, we've solved that problem and found our own way to do it. And it's just stuff like that. Like, we have got like amazing skills because we've had to develop those through other things that we've done, as those then give us those attributes. But it's amazing, and I think it's great how attitudes are changing slowly. Yeah. But surely. And by doing things like this, like you've got this podcast, it's amazing that you can speak to so many different people and elevate those voices. Yeah. And that's the way that we're going to change the world. Like,
look at us, global changes. We'll have that on my tombstone, please and thank you.
Literally. Superwoman over here.
Yeah, like, honestly, casual, don't worry about me. I've only got one final question for you, and you've actually already said it, so which makes me think I already know the answer to the question. But that is, Shannon, can you say that you're disabled and proud?
I am disabled and proud.
Oh, thank you so much for giving up your time today, and thank you so much for being so honest and open about your journey, because I think a lot of people are going to really resonate with that, because it's not easy to talk about hardship. It really isn't. And I really applaud you for talking about it so openly, and thank you for doing it on this platform. I think it's invaluable, and sharing that only ever makes the world a better place.
Yeah, Well, thank you for having me on. And honestly, no, it's been a pleasure. Like, I love having these conversations and being open and as honest as possible. I feel like is the only way to help people. So it is my
Yeah.
pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much, and we'll speak soon.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.